So what I'd like to talk to you all about today is the scenario modeling in GIS that was used for a recent study that we completed for the National Wildlife Federation and the Southern Environmental Law Center. And the study was called Forestry, Bioenergy in the Southeast U.S. Implications for Wildlife Habitat and Biodiversity. So just a little background, just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about with bioenergy and biomass. Some quick definitions of what biomass is in terms of any organic or decomposable matter. And then bioenergy, which is what we're really focused on in this study, is the energy derived from the conversion of this. And so why are we looking at this to begin with? Well, the Southeast recently has emerged as a leading global leader in terms of supply of biomass energy. So if you look at, let's see, is it the pointer here? If you look here, this is projections from 2010 to 2020 in terms of sourcing to Europe, and this is Southeast U.S. pine and other here. So clearly we're growing, and it's starting to become a really big industry in this area. Another fact, that U.S. wood pellets export, don't think the pointer necessarily wants to work, doubled in 2013. So from 2012 to 2013, this doubled. More than 98% of these exports were delivered to Europe, and 99% originated from ports in the Southeast and the lower Mid-Atlantic regions of the county. So why is this starting to be such an industry in the Southeast? Well, we have a lot of supply, and shipping costs are lower simply because of our proximity to the coast and the many ports that we have to be able to get this over to Europe. So the study that we worked on began in the end of 2012, and it was through the National Wildlife Federation and Southern Environmental Law Center, and it was a study for bioenergy and wildlife in the Southeast. And what you see on the right is the final report that was completed for that study, which concluded in December of 2013. What we decided to do for this study, and with talks with the client and looking at all the existing and proposed facilities in the Southeast currently, we picked 6 facilities. So we would have a wide cross-section of land cover types, biodiversity, and biomass sourcing practices. So we picked some that sourced wood pellets and some that did other methods. And so we were able to get this kind of diversity and cross-section, so ultimately we could use this as a way to, for other facilities in the future to be able to model off this process. The project approach, essentially, in terms of our spatially explicit biomass sourcing models, we used a lot of information to get to where we got. So this slide is actually not quite as comprehensive as what you'll see in a few minutes, but essentially we needed to understand, obviously, transportation and biomass competition, as well as additional factors such as pine plantation suitability. We identified risks for forest habitats. We looked at indicator species, and then there was also policy suggestions made. The modeling process that we used for this study, we started with the land cover and species data from GAP. We also created a competition analysis based on transportation distance of 75 miles, network analyst, and looking at demands of other facilities in the woodshed. We looked at different land uses, conservation lands, row crops, developed lands. These are all excluded from the scenarios. There were other masks based on certain policy screens, and each facility had different things that needed to be considered in terms of sourcing screens due to the nature of that facility's land cover. So this workflow developed scenario modeling for 6 woody facilities and looked at multiple scenarios which simulates sourcing for each of these facilities under different sets of constraints. So it seems like it could get kind of complicated if you've got 6 different facilities and you're trying to figure out what's going on. This diagram here was essentially for us to organize how our mapping method would work and translate. So we have some maps here that were created for all 6 facilities. We have our pine plantation suitability that were only created for the ones that were primarily sourcing from pine. We have softwood sourcing created for some facilities, hardwood sourcing, so there's a few facilities that had a mix of softwood and hardwood, and forestry sourcing. So each one of these squares represents a map that was created for the project. And you can see that here. So each one of these is the different facilities, starting with Georgia Biomass, and that's what the end result of each of this mapping effort looks like. So what I'd like to do is quickly go through the one of these case studies, which is going to be the Georgia Biomass, and let you all see these individual maps and then how the results are translated. So the Georgia Biomass facility is an existing facility, and it currently sources 100% yellow pine. And if you see down at the bottom, this is the maps that were on the previous slide. They'll be highlighted throughout, so you'll be able to tell which map is which from the larger graphic. The first map we created is a 75-mile network travel distance, and this map actually delineated the woodshed that we're going to look at for each facility. So basically, this is our boundaries. We have our gap land cover overlaid with conservation lands. We have our travel network analysis and locations of competing bioenergy facilities and pulp mill facilities. So you can see on the eastern side of the map, there's a lot more competing facilities than on the western side, which will then influence the next map in terms of the competition demand strength. And one thing I want to note about the colors on these maps, it's something that it's a little inverse, but we ended up with the following maps doing 5 risk classes from high to low, and high is represented in red, and it really means high potential for biomass, but it could be construed as bad. So just kind of think of a reverse color ramp. Our next model for this facility was the pine plantation suitability. And this was simply done just for facilities where pine plantation is major sourcing, and it takes into consideration road distance, slope, elevation, soils. And then our first map and our competition and pine suitability come together to make a conservation mask, which then leads to our sourcing scenarios. So we have one sourcing scenario looking simply at pine plantation only, one looking at pine, disturbed, and no pasture, one looking at pine, disturbed, and pasture, one looking at upland forest, no pasture, another with upland forest and pasture, and then finally a composite plantation pine conversion risk for natural forest stands. And so in terms of what these maps actually mean in translating this, we ran, some of those were less restrictive scenarios in terms of no restrictions really, and then some were more restrictive scenarios. But if you look at this chart here with our under no protection, you see that 86,000 acres of natural softwood stands would be at high risk. Also under no protection, we would have 43,500 hectares of native forest, including 34,000 of native longleaf pine at risk. And the restrictive scenario limits this. And so with the restrictive scenario, looking at not including any of these sensitive habitats, we were able to realize that the current land cover base for this facility appears sufficient for meeting long-term softwood demands if sustainability criteria that prohibits natural forest stand conversion is adopted. So essentially, we need some policies here for this area because it's such a booming business and there's not a lot of guidelines right now. So for more information on this study, you can visit the National Wildlife Foundation's website. The link is below, and you can download the entire report. And I also would like to, our acknowledgments in terms of our study sponsors and our huge project team of a variety of universities and folks. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison.